It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and 12-year-old Jamal, a quiet but confident boy with a big smile and a love for adventure, decided to walk over to his neighbor's house. Halloween had just passed, and although the holiday was over, there was still a spirit of excitement in the air. Jamal, like so many kids his age, had grown up in a tight-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other, or at least, that's what he thought. With the sun beginning to set and a cool breeze stirring the fallen leaves, Jamal made his way across the street, his heart light and filled with innocent anticipation. He wasn't asking for much, just a piece of candy. It wasn't the first time he had knocked on this door. After all, he'd done it for years, every Halloween, and sometimes just because he liked to talk to Mr. Thompson, the older man who lived there. Mr. Thompson had always been friendly, offering a kind word or a treat whenever Jamal would visit. But this time was different. Jamal's knuckles lightly tapped the door, his feet shuffling on the ground, the smell of autumn in the air. There was no answer. He waited a moment and then knocked again, a little louder this time, a little more insistent. When the door creaked open, the smile on Jamal's face faded slightly as he looked up to meet the eyes of the man he had once considered friendly. Mr. Thompson's face was grim, his eyes narrowed, and there was an unsettling coldness in his voice when he spoke. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharp, unlike anything Jamal had heard before. Jamal stuttered, unsure of how to respond. I just wanted to know if you had any candy left from Halloween," he mumbled. The words felt silly as they left his mouth, but he couldn't help it. He just wanted a piece, a small token of the holiday spirit. He didn't think it would be a big deal. The next few moments unfolded in a blur as Mr. Thompson's demeanor shifted. He stepped closer to the door, his voice rising. "You need to leave. Right now." Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach, his confusion growing. "Go home, boy." The words hung in the air, cutting deeper than any trick or treat could. Jamal blinked, his mind racing. What had just happened? He stood there for a moment, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Thompson's figure loomed in the doorway, his eyes now burning with something that wasn't just anger, but something far colder, more unsettling. Jamal slowly backed away, his body trembling, unsure of what to do next. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The sound echoed in his ears, leaving him standing there in the growing darkness, completely stunned. What had he done wrong? Was it the wrong time to ask? Was it because of who he was? Jamal walked slowly back to his house, his thoughts swirling like the leaves in the wind. He didn't understand what had just happened. It wasn't just that Mr. Thompson had refused him. It was the way he'd acted, the way his tone had changed so quickly, as if Jamal wasn't even a person worth considering. The confusion turned into something else as the days went on, and Jamal realized he wasn't the only one who had noticed the strange interaction. Word started to spread through the neighborhood, whispers passed between parents and friends. Jamal wasn't sure if he should be embarrassed or angry. Was he being overdramatic? He hadn't done anything wrong. He just asked for candy. But then something unexpected happened. A local news outlet picked up the story. It wasn't long before Jamal's experience became more than just an uncomfortable moment. The incident sparked a conversation that stretched beyond the small town and into the wider community. People started to question Mr. Thompson's actions, and the local media began to ask hard questions about race, fear, and how simple gestures could sometimes be misinterpreted, or worse, weaponized. Jamal had never imagined his simple request for candy would make headlines. How could he? At first, he thought the whole thing would blow over, but it didn't. And the more the story unfolded, the more questions arose. What was really going on in that moment? What was the real reason behind Mr. Thompson's reaction? Jamal didn't know. All he knew was that one simple act had turned into something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. As the story continued to unfold, Jamal realized that what happened that day wasn't just about candy. It was about something much deeper, something tied to the very core of how people see each other, how they treat one another, and how their actions, even the smallest ones, can ripple out in ways no one expects. As the news stories continued, more and more people started to speak up. Some supported Jamal, others defended Mr. Thompson. But the truth, it seemed, was still unclear. And with each new development, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. What would happen next? Would the truth ever come to light? Would Jamal ever understand why Mr. Thompson had reacted the way he did? And most importantly, how would the world view this simple encounter, a moment that had started with a knock on the door and ended in something far more complicated, something far more significant than any of them could have predicted? This isn't just Jamal's story. It's a story about us, about how we treat one another, about how one moment can change everything. The question is, how do we move forward from here? The days that followed the incident felt like they were moving in slow motion for Jamal. He couldn't shake the image of Mr. Thompson's face when the door slammed shut in front of him. The harshness of that moment replayed in his mind over and over, each time leaving a different sting. Jamal had always prided himself on being the kind of kid who could roll with anything. He wasn't one to get upset easily, and he definitely wasn't the kind of person to let small things bother him for too long. But this felt different. It wasn't just the rejection, though that hurt enough on its own. It was the way Mr. Thompson had looked at him. That cold, dismissive look. The way his voice had been so sharp. Like Jamal wasn't worth the time it took to answer a simple question. Jamal's mother noticed something was off right away. He wasn't as talkative as he usually was. The usual chatter about school, friends, and the latest video games wasn't there. Instead, he seemed distant, lost in thought, as though his mind was somewhere far away. At dinner one night, after Jamal had barely touched his food, his mother finally asked what was wrong. She didn't press him at first, but the concern in her eyes was enough to make Jamal open up. "I went to Mr. Thompson's house," Jamal began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I asked him if he had any candy left over from Halloween, and he told me to leave. He said, 'Go home, boy.'" His mother set down her fork, her expression darkening as she studied Jamal's face. "What do you mean, 'go home, boy'?" she asked slowly, as though the words themselves didn't quite make sense. "I don't know," Jamal replied, his voice shaking a little. "I just asked if he had candy, like I always do, and he acted different. I don't know why, Mom. I didn't do anything wrong." Jamal's mother let out a long sigh, running a hand over her face. "Jamal," she began, her tone softer now, but heavy with something else, something Jamal hadn't quite been able to place. "There are some things about this world, things that don't make sense, things we can't always control. People can act in ways that seem strange or even hurtful, and sometimes it's because of things you don't know about them, things they've experienced or beliefs they hold. And sometimes, Jamal, people treat others badly because of how they look, how they're seen in the world." Jamal frowned, not fully understanding what his mother meant. He had never thought that Mr. Thompson saw him any differently than anyone else in the neighborhood. After all, he'd always been friendly, until that moment. But his mother's words stuck with him, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. Was there something Jamal didn't understand about why Mr. Thompson had reacted the way he did? The news didn't help. In fact, it made everything worse. The next day, Jamal overheard a conversation between his parents. They weren't trying to hide it, but they weren't exactly speaking openly either. The local news had picked up the story, and it had spread like wildfire through the community. It wasn't just a local story anymore. The headline alone was enough to catch anyone's attention. "Naked chases young black boy away after Halloween request. Community in shock." Jamal felt his stomach twist as he listened to the reporters describe the incident, calling it troubling and disturbing. But there was one detail they didn't have. They didn't know what had really happened behind that closed door. They didn't know what Jamal had felt when Mr. Thompson's words hit him like a slap. And they didn't know the weight of the tension that had built up between them that afternoon. His mind raced with thoughts of the people in his neighborhood. People had started to talk, to speculate. Some defended Mr. Thompson, saying it was probably a misunderstanding. Maybe he was just having a bad day. But others wondered if there was something deeper at play. Could Mr. Thompson have acted the way he did because of Jamal's race? It wasn't a question Jamal wanted to ask himself, but the longer the story lingered in the news, the more he couldn't avoid it. He had never thought about it that way before. He had grown up in a community where everyone knew each other, where he'd never felt different. He'd always played with the other kids on his block, regardless of the color of their skin, and he'd always been greeted with kindness from the adults in the neighborhood. But now, every time he saw someone glance at him in the street, he felt their eyes linger a little longer. Was it sympathy? Curiosity? Judgment? Even his friends at school had started to ask questions. "Hey Jamal, I saw that thing on the news. What happened with Mr. Thompson?" They'd ask, their voices tinged with concern. Jamal wasn't sure how to answer them. He wasn't even sure how to answer himself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the story wasn't just about one moment. It was about a pattern, a deeper issue that ran under the surface of his everyday life. It was about what it meant to be a young black boy in a world that often saw him through a different lens, a lens of fear, suspicion, and sometimes even hostility. The questions kept coming, but the answers seemed just out of reach. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What had really happened in that moment at Mr. Thompson's door? Was it just a random act of rudeness? Or was there something more to it, something bigger, that Jamal didn't fully understand yet? But the more he wondered, the more questions arose. What was the truth behind Mr. Thompson's behavior? Why had he reacted the way he did? And why had the neighborhood's response been so divided? The tension between what Jamal had experienced and what people were saying was eating at him. He couldn't just let it go. This wasn't something he could forget. He had to know what was really going on, had to understand why things were unfolding the way they were. But each time he thought he was getting closer to an answer, the mystery only seemed to grow. And so Jamal found himself at a crossroads. He had to decide whether to keep pushing, to dig deeper into the story and risk everything in the process, or to let it go, to accept the uncertainty and hope it all eventually faded away. But there was one thing Jamal knew for sure: whatever he decided, the world had changed in ways he hadn't expected, and now, more than ever, the weight of those questions pressed down on him, leaving him uncertain of what the next chapter of his story would look like. The only thing he could be certain of was that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days that followed seemed to stretch on endlessly. Jamal couldn't escape the whispers. It wasn't just at school anymore. He could feel it in the air every time he walked down the street, in the awkward pauses between his neighbors' words. Everyone had an opinion, and Jamal could hear them all, whether they were spoken or unspoken. Some of his friends avoided him, unsure of how to handle the tension that was now swirling around him. Others tried to act normal, but their eyes betrayed their curiosity. They wanted to know what had happened at Mr. Thompson's house, but no one really asked Jamal directly, as if they were afraid to uncover something they weren't ready to hear. Jamal, for his part, didn't know how to handle it either. He wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, to just keep moving forward like nothing had changed. But that moment, that cold rejection, kept replaying in his head. Each time it did, a new layer of discomfort seemed to surface. Maybe his mom had been right. Maybe people did see him differently, like he wasn't supposed to be in certain spaces, like he didn't belong. But he hadn't asked for anything unusual. He hadn't done anything to deserve it. Why was it so hard for them to just see him for who he was? And then there was Mr. Thompson. Jamal hadn't seen him since the incident, but his name was everywhere now. The man who had chased a young boy away over a simple request for candy. The man who'd sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The news articles continued to spread, and every time Jamal glanced at them, the words blurred together. He'd never thought much of Mr. Thompson before. The man had always been quiet, a little reserved, but never anything to make Jamal feel uncomfortable. That was the hardest part to wrap his head around. Why had Mr. Thompson acted like that? Jamal wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but he wasn't sure how. What could he even say? He was just a kid. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson owed him something, an explanation, an apology, anything that would make this whole thing make sense. One afternoon, Jamal found himself walking down the street with his hands in his pockets, his thoughts clouded. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, but it felt different now. He passed by the old park where he'd spent countless hours playing basketball, the sound of kids' laughter in the air, but it all felt distant. The community that had once felt like home now felt alien, as though something had shifted just beneath the surface, something Jamal couldn't quite touch. As he walked past the row of houses, he noticed a small crowd gathered in front of Mr. Thompson's house. At first, Jamal thought it was just a group of people stopping to chat, but then he heard the raised voices. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He didn't even give the boy a chance. One voice said, the words sharp with anger. "They say the kid's been getting a lot of attention." Another voice muttered, quieter, but just as tense. "I don't care what the news says. I saw it with my own eyes. Mr. Thompson should have known better." Jamal couldn't move. He knew they were talking about him. He wasn't ready to face this yet, not like this. He turned and started to walk away, his feet carrying him automatically, but his mind raced. It wasn't just the incident anymore. It had become something bigger, something everyone was talking about, something everyone was trying to figure out. They were talking about race, about how Jamal had been treated differently because of the color of his skin. They were talking about fear, about how people sometimes let their fears dictate their actions. It wasn't just about a candy request anymore. It was about Jamal's place in the world. It was about how people saw him, how he saw himself, and whether anyone would ever be able to understand what he was going through. Back at home, his mom noticed the shift in him. She could tell he was struggling. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but something in his posture had changed. He was withdrawn, distant. She didn't push him to talk, but she made sure to keep the conversation light when she saw him retreat to his room. But the weight was still there, a pressure building inside Jamal's chest, suffocating him. One evening, after a long day of hearing nothing but whispers and watching the world around him shift, Jamal went outside to get some fresh air. He leaned against the porch railing, looking up at the stars. He liked to do this when he was feeling lost, look at the sky and try to make sense of it all. But tonight, even the stars didn't seem to make things clearer. That's when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jamal pulled it out, half expecting to see another news alert or a message from a friend asking what had really happened with Mr. Thompson. Instead, it was a text from his cousin Deshawn. "Yo, you see the news? They're still talking about it. Some people are calling Mr. Thompson a racist." Jamal stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was that what people were saying now? That Mr. Thompson had acted out of racism? Jamal didn't know if he believed that. But there was something inside him, a gnawing feeling that told him this was about more than just one man's behavior. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he closed his phone and stared out into the night. The shadows of the trees in the yard stretched long across the grass, the wind rustling their leaves. He wanted so badly to find answers, to make sense of what had happened, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. It slipped through his fingers no matter how hard he tried. It was only when he heard a familiar voice calling from the front door that he snapped out of his thoughts. His mom was standing there, her figure framed in the doorway, a look of concern on her face. "Jamal, you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the kind of worry he couldn't ignore. He nodded but didn't move. "Yeah, just thinking." She stepped out onto the porch, joining him at the railing. They stood there in silence for a moment, looking up at the stars together. Jamal's mom didn't push him to talk, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to remind him that he wasn't alone in this. And for the first time in days, Jamal felt a tiny flicker of comfort. But the question still burned in his mind, relentless and unanswered. What had really happened with Mr. Thompson? Was this a case of one man's bad decision, or was it part of something much bigger? Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about candy anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. And the truth, whatever it was, seemed just out of reach. The days that followed were heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words and tense glances. Jamal had hoped things would die down. He thought the story might fade into the background, that things would go back to normal. But with each passing day, the neighborhood buzzed louder, and the tension seemed to grow. Jamal couldn't escape it. Everywhere he went, he could feel eyes on him, like people were watching him, waiting for something to happen. The whispers that had once been casual had turned into something sharper, something more accusatory. His friends at school were no better. Some of them tried to be supportive, but their voices always carried that undertone of uncertainty. "Hey, are you doing okay?" one of them asked, trying to sound casual, but the question felt loaded, as though they were waiting for him to say something more. They didn't understand, they couldn't. They hadn't lived through the feeling of being looked at differently, of knowing that something was off, but not having the words to explain it. The days blurred together as the situation with Mr. Thompson simmered beneath the surface. Jamal's parents had tried to talk to him about it, but the conversations always felt forced, like they were walking on eggshells around him. They didn't know what to say, what to do. Jamal didn't have answers for them, and the silence between them felt as suffocating as the questions swirling in his mind. He had tried to forget it all, tried to push it away, but it was impossible. It was always there, waiting in the background, just out of reach. And then came the call. It was late one evening when the phone rang. Jamal had just finished his homework, and his mom had gone to bed early, the house quiet and still. He picked up the phone, expecting another call from his cousin, but the voice on the other end froze him in his tracks. It was from a reporter. Jamal's heart raced as the woman on the other end introduced herself, explaining that she was doing a follow-up on the story about the incident with Mr. Thompson. Jamal's first instinct was to hang up, but something in the woman's voice made him hesitate. She wasn't accusatory, just curious. She wanted to know more. She wanted to hear his side of the story. Jamal stood in the kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear, his hands trembling. He hadn't expected any of this, didn't want any of it. But here it was, knocking on his door, demanding answers. The reporter was polite, but her questions were pointed. "Can you tell me what happened when you asked for candy? Was there anything unusual about how Mr. Thompson reacted? How did he treat you? What did you think was going through his mind?" Jamal swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her questions pressing down on him. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what Mr. Thompson had been thinking that day, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something about it all was wrong, something he hadn't yet understood. He started talking, his voice shaky at first, but the more he spoke, the more the weight lifted off his chest. He wasn't sure where it would go, but for the first time in days, he felt like he was being heard. "All I wanted was some candy," Jamal said quietly, his words coming out slow but steady. "I don't know why he acted the way he did. He's always been nice before, you know. But that day, it was like he saw something in me that wasn't there before, like he saw me as a threat or something." The reporter was silent for a moment, and Jamal could hear her scribbling something down. "I see," she said, her voice calm but filled with an edge of something deeper. "What do you think that means? What do you think it says about how people see you, Jamal?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't know. He didn't have the words for it. But the more he thought about it, the more the truth began to settle in. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson. It was the way people looked at him now, the way they saw him through a lens he hadn't asked for. It was the way they whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. It was the way they treated him like he didn't belong, like he was different from everyone else, just because of the color of his skin. Jamal didn't know if he was ready to face this yet. He didn't know if he was strong enough to fight the bigger battle that was unfolding around him. But there was no going back now. His voice was shaking as he spoke, but it was louder than it had ever been before. "I just want to be treated like everyone else. I don't want people to look at me and see something different. I don't want them to be scared of me." The reporter paused again, her silence heavy. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Jamal. I know this isn't easy. He hung up the phone without saying another word. He stood there in the kitchen, the room spinning around him as everything he had been holding inside began to crash to the surface. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew this moment would change everything. The questions weren't going to go away. They were going to keep coming, harder and faster, until there was no way to ignore them anymore. Jamal didn't know how to face this, how to deal with the fact that he was now at the center of something far bigger than he could have imagined. The next day, things escalated quickly. The news story hit a boiling point when a local community meeting was scheduled to discuss the incident with Mr. Thompson. People were outraged, divided. Some demanded action. Others called it an overreaction. Jamal's name was being thrown around like a hot potato, everyone trying to make sense of what had happened, everyone trying to take sides. Jamal didn't want to be part of the spectacle. He didn't want to be used as a pawn in some bigger game. He just wanted answers, closure. But as the meeting drew closer, Jamal felt the weight of everything pressing in on him. He knew something had to give. The walls were closing in. Mr. Thompson hadn't spoken to anyone since the incident, and the questions surrounding him only grew more intense. Was he racist? Had he reacted out of fear? Or was there something more personal at play? The night before the meeting, Jamal lay awake in bed, his mind racing. He couldn't sleep. Tomorrow would be the day when everything would come to a head, when the truth, whatever it was, would finally come to light. But as the hours passed, Jamal realized that he wasn't just waiting for the truth to be uncovered. He was waiting for the moment that would define him, the moment when the story would no longer be about Candy or Mr. Thompson, but about him. And what he would do next could change everything. The night before the community meeting, Jamal lay wide awake in his bed, his mind unable to find peace. The weight of everything pressing down on him felt like it was about to crush him. Tomorrow was the day that would define so much of what had happened over the past week. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew the tension in the neighborhood had reached a breaking point. Everything was spiraling, and it wasn't just the incident with Mr. Thompson anymore. It was the way the entire community had become divided, each person taking sides, arguing over who was right and who was wrong. The streets felt quieter now, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Jamal hadn't told anyone, but he was terrified. He wanted to go to the meeting, to stand up and finally say something that would make everything make sense. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he was ready to be the person everyone was looking to. He didn't have all the answers. He just had his truth. But would anyone listen? Would they hear him? Or would they just see him as a symbol of something bigger, something that wasn't even his fault? But as the clock ticked past midnight, something changed. Jamal's phone buzzed on the nightstand. At first, he didn't want to look. It was late, and he'd been trying to sleep. But the urge to check was too strong, so he reached over and picked up the phone. It was another text from his cousin Deshawn. "Yo, man, you need to see this. They're talking about you. It's not just in the neighborhood anymore. The story's blowing up all over the news." Jamal's heart sank. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitation creeping in. But he knew he couldn't avoid it. He opened the message, and a link to a news video appeared. His stomach twisted as he tapped the link. The video started automatically, and the familiar faces of reporters filled the screen. Jamal's eyes scanned the words on the screen, but they didn't make sense at first. They were talking about him, about what had happened with Mr. Thompson, but this wasn't just about a single interaction anymore. This was something bigger, something that threatened to overshadow everything else. The report focused on Mr. Thompson, but the twist came when they showed footage of a different part of the neighborhood. It was a local business owner, a woman who had lived down the street from Jamal for years, speaking into the camera with a mixture of anger and frustration. "I saw what happened. I know what people are saying, but they don't know the whole story. Mr. Thompson didn't just chase that boy away. He was protecting his property. There have been a lot of break-ins in this area lately, and it's not just random kids asking for candy. People don't want to admit it, But we all know what's been happening around here, she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Jamal's eyes widened as the report continued. There were more interviews, more voices speaking up, all suggesting the same thing. People were starting to claim that the incident wasn't just about race, it was about fear. Fear of the rising crime in the neighborhood, fear of young black boys being perceived as a threat. Mr. Thompson, they said, had acted out of fear, not hate. The narrative was shifting, and suddenly, Jamal wasn't just a victim of a simple misunderstanding. He was part of a much larger, much darker conversation about race, fear, and safety. Jamal's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of those words sinking in, the implications settling on his chest. Was that what people thought of him? Was he a threat? He didn't know how to react. He had always been told that everyone had their own perspective, that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. But now, everything felt more complicated than ever. As the report finished, the anchor cut to a live broadcast of the community meeting. Jamal's stomach dropped as the camera zoomed in on the packed room. He recognized a few faces, neighbors who had always been friendly, now wearing expressions of distrust or concern. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions. But there was something else too, a sense of unease that Jamal hadn't anticipated. He felt the sudden need to go to the meeting. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore. It wasn't even just about the candy. This had grown into something much more serious, something that was now affecting the entire community. Jamal wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve by showing up, but he couldn't just sit back and let the narrative spin out of control. He had to be there. Minutes later, Jamal found himself dressed and heading out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The streets were quieter than usual as he walked toward the community center, the air still and heavy. As he got closer, he saw a crowd gathered outside, a mix of people milling about, their faces set with purpose. He hesitated, then pushed his way through, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. Inside, the room was filled to capacity, the tension so thick it almost felt like you could touch it. Jamal stood by the back, trying to stay out of sight, his eyes scanning the room. He could see Mr. Thompson sitting near the front, his face pale and tight with anxiety. His hands were clenched in his lap, his entire posture stiff, as if he were bracing for impact. Jamal wondered if he felt guilty, if he understood what he had done, or if he truly believed that his actions were justified. The man looked so different now, so small compared to the towering figure he had been in Jamal's mind before everything had happened. As the meeting began, a local councillor stood up to speak, his voice calm but firm. "We need to address what happened between Mr. Thompson and young Jamal. This is not just a personal issue, it's a community issue. It's about how we see each other and how we protect each other. Fear has divided us, and it's time we faced that head-on." Jamal's eyes darted nervously around the room. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but it seemed impossible to avoid. The longer he stood there, the more he realized that this wasn't going to be a simple discussion. This was going to be a fight. There were people in the room who believed that Mr. Thompson had acted out of protection. Others were ready to accuse him of racial profiling, of treating Jamal unfairly because of the color of his skin. The conversation was heating up, and Jamal knew that the next few moments would determine everything. Before anyone could speak again, the doors to the back of the room burst open with a force that made everyone turn. Jamal froze. Standing in the doorway, a figure stepped into the room, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. It was Mr. Thompson's daughter, someone Jamal had known growing up. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a lawyer, and what they held in their hands made the entire room go silent. A piece of paper, the kind of paper that could change everything. Jamal's pulse quickened as she made her way to the front. The silence in the room was deafening, and the audience's eyes flicked between her, Mr. Thompson, and the lawyer. Jamal couldn't breathe. Something was happening, something bigger than he could have ever imagined. The next words she spoke would shake the foundation of everything Jamal had believed about the situation. The room went deathly quiet as Mr. Thompson's daughter stepped up to the front, the lawyer standing just behind her, holding a thick envelope. Jamal felt his stomach twist into knots. Something was coming, but he couldn't put his finger on what. It was as if the air in the room had thickened, every eye in the place now focused solely on the girl and the lawyer. The woman's voice was calm, but Jamal could see the tension in her shoulders, in the way she shifted nervously from one foot to the other. She cleared her throat before speaking, and everyone leaned in. "I'm here to clear up some things," she said, her eyes moving quickly over the crowd. "Things that have been misunderstood, things that people haven't been told." Jamal's heart skipped. She wasn't just here for a simple apology. She had something to say, something bigger than what anyone had anticipated. She turned toward her father, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Mr. Thompson looked both relieved and afraid, like a man who knew something was about to be revealed, but wasn't sure how the world would react. Jamal couldn't help but wonder what had been going on behind the scenes in the days since the incident. He hadn't been the only one dealing with the fallout. Mr. Thompson had his own burdens to carry. Jamal's mind raced. Was this some kind of confession? Had Mr. Thompson done something worse than just chasing him away? Was there more to this story? The thoughts swirled around, each one more troubling than the last. The lawyer stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "This is about the events that took place last week, but there are things that need to be understood from a legal standpoint." He glanced down at the envelope in his hand, then handed it to Mr. Thompson's daughter. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she pulled out several pages of official documents. Jamal could feel everyone watching, waiting for her to speak. He took a deep breath, unsure of what he was about to hear. The suspense was unbearable. "This," she began, holding up the document for everyone to see, "is a security camera footage release from the Thompson residence, footage that wasn't made available to the public until now." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. What happened on the day of the incident wasn't what people thought. Mr. Thompson didn't just chase Jamal away out of fear. There was something else happening that no one knew about. Jamal's pulse quickened as the lawyer nodded, urging her to continue. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting Jamal's for a moment before she spoke again, her voice softer now. "We've had multiple break-ins in the neighborhood recently. That day, Mr. Thompson wasn't acting out of suspicion alone. He was responding to something far bigger. Someone had broken into his house earlier that afternoon. It wasn't Jamal, but he didn't know that at the time. He didn't know who was outside his door when Jamal knocked." She hesitated, as though she were weighing the impact of each word. The person who broke in had left something behind, a knife. And Mr. Thompson, who had been afraid for his life, didn't know whether the person who knocked on his door was coming back. Jamal froze, trying to process the revelation. The crowd around him shifted, murmuring softly. His mind raced. The story he had been told, the one that had haunted him for days, suddenly started to look different. But that wasn't all. There was more. The lawyer stepped forward again. "The footage we reviewed shows that Mr. Thompson wasn't expecting a visitor. He had no idea that the break-in earlier was unrelated to Jamal. He saw Jamal on his doorstep and acted out of fear, not hatred. That is why he reacted the way he did." A collective gasp filled the room, and Jamal could feel the tension shift. People were starting to process the new information, but a new confusion settled in. The room had been divided. Half believed Mr. Thompson had acted out of racism, half thought he'd acted out of fear. But now it was a mix of both, with the underlying current of uncertainty still present. Before anyone could digest what had just been revealed, Jamal heard a sudden sound from the back of the room. A person rushed in through the doors, breathless, eyes wide with panic. Jamal's heart skipped. It was his mom. Her voice was shaky as she stepped forward. "There's something else you all need to know," she said, looking right at Jamal, then at the crowd. She was holding something in her hand. "Another document. This just came through. I didn't know until now, but it changes everything. She handed the paper to the lawyer, who quickly skimmed it, his face paling as he read. The room went deathly silent. "This document," the lawyer said, his voice cracking, "is a police report detailing an incident that happened 2 days before the break-in at the Thompsons' house. An incident involving someone we all know." He looked at Jamal, then back to the crowd. Jamal's stomach twisted into knots as he saw the reaction of those around him. He didn't need to read the paper to know what it was. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson's fear that had caused the tension. There was something deeper, darker, behind the entire situation. Jamal wasn't just a boy who had knocked on a door asking for candy. He was a part of a much larger, tangled story, a story that involved more than one person, more than one event. The police report revealed that, in the days before the break-in at the Thompson house, there had been a string of burglaries in the area, and one of the suspects had been seen in the vicinity of Jamal's neighborhood. The police report, though, indicated that this suspect wasn't an outsider. This was someone from the neighborhood, someone who was connected to the community in ways that no one had expected. Someone who, in an ironic twist of fate, had once been a friend to Mr. Thompson. Jamal's mind reeled as he pieced together the fragments of the story. Mr. Thompson had been scared, yes, but not just of Jamal. There was someone else, someone closer to home, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. And suddenly, Jamal realized that the incident wasn't just about him. It was about a web of secrets, lies, and unspoken fears that no one had wanted to address until now. As the crowd murmured, Jamal's mom took a step forward, her voice calm but steady. "This is not just about Jamal," she said, her eyes meeting his. "This is about our entire community, and we have to face the truth of what's been happening around us." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching as everything started to make sense. The pieces were falling into place, and with them, a new understanding of the complicated reality he had been caught in. But as the room simmered with revelations and new questions, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. This wasn't over, it had just begun. The room was still, the weight of the revelations settling heavily on everyone's shoulders. Jamal could feel the eyes on him, but he wasn't sure if he could meet anyone's gaze. He hadn't expected any of this. It wasn't just about the incident with Mr. Thompson anymore. It was a story that revealed deeper fractures in the community, a story that intertwined fear, distrust, and a growing sense of unease that no one had been able to address until now. The lawyer had stopped speaking, but the room remained quiet, everyone processing what they had just learned. The police report, the secrets it revealed, the unexpected connections, it all painted a picture of a neighborhood far more complex than anyone had imagined. Jamal could feel the air thick with discomfort, but there was also a shift happening. The understanding was beginning to form, but it wasn't complete. Not yet. The questions still lingered. How would the neighborhood move forward? What would change? Jamal's mom stepped forward, breaking the silence, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We can't let fear control us anymore," she said, looking around the room, her eyes full of conviction. "Yes, there's been crime. Yes, there are things that we don't understand, things we haven't wanted to face. But we can't let fear turn us against each other. We've seen the damage it's done." She glanced at Mr. Thompson, who was still sitting quietly in his seat, his eyes cast down, unable to make eye contact. "We can't pretend we're not part of this, whether we want to be or not," she continued. "But what we can do is choose to do better, to work together, and not let this incident define who we are as a community." Her words seemed to reach the crowd, breaking the tension that had held everyone in place. Slowly, murmurs started to rise as people exchanged glances, some nodding, others still uncertain. Jamal noticed that even Mr. Thompson was lifting his head, his face showing the first signs of remorse. He was listening, really listening, for the first time since the incident. The tension in the room didn't dissolve entirely, but something important had shifted. The community wasn't ready to forget the past, but it was beginning to understand that healing would only happen if they faced it together. The fear that had once divided them was now an opportunity to grow, to rebuild trust, and to make things right. Jamal glanced at the door, his thoughts drifting back to that moment when he had first knocked on Mr. Thompson's door. He hadn't known it at the time, but his simple request for candy had ignited a chain of events that had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. It wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about a community that had been living in the shadows of its own fears, too scared to confront what was really going on. As the meeting wound down, people began to leave, but Jamal stayed behind, standing by the door, his mind racing. He felt a sense of calm washing over him, but it was tinged with a bittersweet understanding of the complexities of what had happened. The community was fractured, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for it to heal. Jamal's mom joined him by the door, her face soft but tired. "You did good today," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You didn't let the fear take control. You stood up for yourself and for what's right. I'm proud of you." Jamal smiled faintly, but the weight of the day still hung heavily on his heart. "It's not over, though. There's so much more we need to do." "Yes," she agreed, her voice thoughtful. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and people who are willing to listen and learn. And today, that's what happened. People listened." Jamal nodded, but his thoughts were still tangled. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more conversations, more challenges to face. There would be people who still refused to see things from different perspectives, and there would be those who continued to hold onto their biases. But Jamal knew one thing for sure: the events of the past week had changed him. They had forced him to see the world through a new lens, one that was more compassionate, more understanding of the complexities that shaped people's actions. As Jamal and his mom stepped outside, the evening sky was calm, the stars twinkling overhead. The neighborhood felt quieter now, but there was a certain hopefulness in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing ever was. But Jamal felt like he had a chance to shape the narrative now, to be a part of something bigger than himself. Back at home, as Jamal sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts kept returning to Mr. Thompson. The man who had once been an intimidating figure in his mind was now just a man, vulnerable and full of regret. Jamal wondered if he would ever really understand what had driven him to act the way he had. Would Mr. Thompson ever see him as a person, or would he always just see Jamal as a threat? But that wasn't Jamal's burden to bear. It was up to the community to decide whether they wanted to move forward in fear or with understanding. Jamal had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. The next morning, as Jamal walked to school, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered, but there was a new sense of clarity in his heart. He knew that change was never easy, that it would take time and effort from everyone involved. But he also knew that the conversation had begun, and that in itself was powerful. As he passed the familiar houses on his street, Jamal couldn't help but notice something different. The air felt lighter. Maybe it was the understanding that had begun to form in the community. Maybe it was the simple fact that people were starting to talk to each other again, not as strangers, but as neighbors who shared the same hopes and fears. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but Jamal had learned something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. That change, no matter how small, always starts with a single step. And sometimes that step begins with just knocking on a door. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Jamal felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. He didn't have all the answers, but he had hope. And sometimes, hope was all you needed to start making things right.